So friends, shortly after the Supreme Court granted him absolute presidential immunity, Donald Trump endorsed the use of military tribunals to prosecute the enemies of American democracy. In other words, if somebody, say, used violence to try to overthrow American democracy, that person could be prosecuted by a military tribunal. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirschner here. Well, friends, as you well know by now, the Supreme Court ruled that Donald Trump has not one, but two kinds of presidential immunity. When he is doing things that are part of his core constitutional powers, he has absolute presidential immunity with literally no questions asked. Nobody can ask or investigate whether what he did was motivated by a lawful purpose or a lawless purpose. You are not permitted to ask. Why? Because he has absolute presidential immunity. And then for other sort of run-of-the-mill official presidential acts that aren't necessarily core constitutional powers, he has what the Supreme Court calls presumptive immunity. But friends, given the test the Supreme Court set out for presumptive immunity, it is damn near absolute immunity. So, with these new powers, Donald Trump just endorsed, promised us, in essence, that he will use military tribunals to prosecute, to punish the enemies of democracy, in reality, his enemies. But let's just stick with the premise that he will use military tribunals to punish the enemies of American democracy. Let's start with the new reporting. This from the New York Times. Headline: Trump amplifies calls to jail top elected officials, invokes military tribunals. A post that Mr. Trump circulated on Sunday called for Liz Cheney to be prosecuted by a military court reserved for enemy combatants and war criminals. And that article begins, former President Donald Trump over the weekend escalated his vows to prosecute his political opponents, circulating posts on his social media website invoking televised military tribunals and calling for the jailing of President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Senators Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, and former Vice President Mike Pence, among other high-profile politicians. Mr. Trump, using his account on Truth Social on Sunday, promoted two posts from other users of the site that called for the jailing of his perceived political enemies. One post that he circulated on Sunday signaled out Liz Cheney, the former Wyoming Congresswoman who is a Republican critic of Mr. Trump's, and called for her to be prosecuted by a type of military court reserved for enemy combatants and war criminals. Quote, Elizabeth Liz Cheney is guilty of treason, the post said. Retruth if you want televised military tribunals. And Donald Trump did what? He reposted it, clearly signaling that he approves. You know, if elected, there's no doubt he intends to use military tribunals to prosecute folks like Liz Cheney, presumably Adam Kinzinger, and others. But remember, in reality, in the fact-based world in which we live, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger sacrificed their jobs, their position, their power to try to fight to preserve American democracy. But none of that matters, because if he is again elected, Donald Trump will simply label them enemies of democracy, and he will direct that they be prosecuted by a military tribunal. And the Supreme Court will let him do it. They've got his back because, you know, official presidential powers and duties cloak him in Supreme Court approved immunity. And friends, before I make this next point or offer this next observation, let me say one thing. I don't much care for lawlessness. I'm kind of a rule of law guy. I spent my entire career fighting for the rule of law and protecting the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Starting back in the 80s, I was an Army JAG prosecutor enforcing the rule of law. When I left military service, I joined the Department of Justice, where I served as a federal prosecutor for decades. And not only a federal prosecutor, but for those of you who don't know how the Department of Justice is set up organizationally, federal prosecutors in Washington, D.C., specifically at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, are federal prosecutors like the federal prosecutors in all states and in the territories, but we are the only ones who are also the local prosecutors. D.C. is not a state. They don't have a district attorney's office. So the feds do all the federal prosecuting, and unlike every other U.S. attorney's office, we do all the local prosecuting. We are basically the district attorneys for the District of Columbia, which is why we try so darn many cases as federal prosecutors in Washington, D.C. So I'm just not a fan of lawlessness. I consider myself a pretty hardcore rule of law guy. But what should we do with this new reality in which we live, where if you're the president, the lawless is now lawful, or at least it's not subject to any kind of punishment because as president, you are now above and beyond the reach of our nation's laws. We know what Donald Trump will do with this new power. He just told us he will prosecute his enemies, including at military commissions or military tribunals, which are separate and apart from our civilian criminal justice system. Doesn't even have the same procedures, or some might say the same protections. Doesn't matter. He will say, hey, I'm a commander-in-chief. I don't need to act lawfully. The Supreme Court has told me that. They have my back. I can do whatever I damn well please, and I will have absolute, or at least presumptive immunity, which is, absolute immunity -1. So I will order military tribunals for all of the enemies of democracy, my perceived enemies, and off we go. That's what Donald Trump will do if he is elected. I still don't believe he will be, but if he is, he has already promised us military tribunals for his enemies are coming. So with that knowledge, the question is obvious. What does Joe Biden do with this newly acquired presidential absolute immunity, the power of what we generally think of as lawlessness? The power of lawlessness, right? Kind of makes me a little nauseous just saying it, but that's what the Supreme Court just said. What does Joe Biden do with it? Donald Trump will use it for evil. If Joe Biden were to use it, I think we would all agree, living in the fact-based world in which we do, he would use it for good. He would use it to actually hold accountable the folks who tried to overturn American democracy, who tried to throw out all of our votes and criminally, unconstitutionally keep Donald Trump installed in the presidency. If we look back and Donald Trump is elected and Joe Biden has opted not to use any of these powers, just kind of let it ride, hope for the best, and Donald Trump begins to use these powers to round up and prosecute his perceived enemies by simply labeling them as an absolutely immune president, enemies of democracy, how will we feel? How will we feel about, Joe Biden's decision? And I'm assuming it would be a decision, that by which he stood on principle, didn't feel right, didn't want to do it, right? Felt lawless. Well, when the Supreme Court says the lawless is lawful, where do you go with that? I don't know. But what I do know is we're going to be talking a lot about things like military tribunals in the days and weeks to come. And we're going to try to drill down on that a little bit because Donald Trump said they're coming. And the Supreme Court apparently will not stop it. They will have his back regardless of what he does. So what do we do? Because to us, justice matters. Friends, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.